Hey there, welcome back to 31 Days of Horror, and we are on day 20. And today I checked out the movie Hollyblood. And an interesting thing happened here. So this movie is on Netflix, and it is touted as a horror comedy. And the premise of the movie is that there is a teenage high school student who is pretending to be a vampire to impress a girl, and meanwhile, in the background, there's an actual vampire that's kind of like hunting him down and is getting irritated that, his uh, identity is sort of being stolen by this foolish mortal teenager. Um, and the reason that I said an interesting thing happened with this movie is that I started watching it. It is originally in Spanish, and the text in the movie is all in Spanish, which is slightly important because there is some text conversation done through a chat room as part of the plot, and all of that is in Spanish. However, everything is dubbed and translated into English. So all the voices are overdubbed, and all of the text that's printed is also narrated over. So in terms of translations, all of that is done pretty well. I will say that the way that the dub is done kind of makes it a little campier, but the fact that it's a horror comedy, I think this lends itself really well to that. And as I was watching this movie, it was enjoyable. The characters are, even though, like I said, it's dubbed, so you're not really getting the same necessarily emotional performances from the actors and actresses because you're getting the voices of somebody else recorded well after the movie was made. The actors and actresses, their expressions were great. Whoever did the overdubbing really seemed to match the energy of the characters as they're portrayed in the movie, which is really great because you don't always encounter that when you have the language transitions. But an interesting thing happened while I was watching the movie. The characters seemed familiar, especially the main boy in the movie. His name's Javi in the movie. He seemed very familiar to me. So I ended up looking up, on IMDb, have I seen this guy in something else before? And I looked through his filmography, and it's mostly, Spanish-speaking things. I don't speak Spanish as my native language. I speak a little bit. I've learned a little bit, and I do work with some Spanish-speaking people, so I have at least a working knowledge of it. But I am not fluent. I do not speak it in my everyday life. And I was not familiar with any of the other titles that this guy was in, and yet I'm still like, he looks really familiar. And then they introduced another character, and he's kind of the comic relief character, and he has a very distinct look to him. And I said, well, he looks really familiar too. I bet I've seen him in something else. And I look him up, same thing, and he's an actor that I don't know that he's even really been in much else. And so I have not seen him in anything else. And I'm watching the movie, I start realizing that the movie feels very deja vu. I have no idea what's going to happen in this movie, but everything seems extremely familiar. The story seems familiar, the plot seems familiar. I kind of know where it's going, but I have no knowledge of the ending of the movie. And then I realized I actually watched this movie last year. And that's why everything was seeming so familiar. And the reason that I decided to not just pick a different movie, watch something else, and do a different review video on that is because I've mentioned this kind of movie before in past videos, and this is a really great example of what I was talking about. I've mentioned before that movies that I've watched, they're fine. They're good. They're not bad. They're enjoyable, whatever, but I will completely forget that I've watched this movie. It's something that I've said about, other movies that I've reviewed that are okay. It's usually a PG-13 horror movie thing. This is one of those movies. This is one of those movies that even though it was mildly entertaining, it was a bit corny, over the top a little bit with their, Twilight-y vampire shaming. But not a bad movie. Enjoyable watch for the time that you're watching it, but nothing extremely notable or different where there's any one scene or any one character or any lines that really stick out to you. So you enjoy it while you're experiencing it, and then it just kind of goes away and it fades into wherever it is. And that's why it's just one of those movies that you're scrolling through and Netflix, and you're like, oh, this one looks pretty good. I'm going to check this out. And you might turn it on and you might watch a little bit of it and then go, wait, have I watched this before? I don't remember. I don't remember this part. I don't remember, but I remember these characters. I remember this actor. I haven't seen him else in anything. And there's a couple of other movies like that that I can mention. Uh, One of them is There's Someone in Your House. That's also a Netflix movie. I have now watched that two entirely different times, and every time I'm scrolling through Facebook looking for a spooky movie to watch, I stop on this, I read the description, and I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty good. Why haven't I watched this before? And then I turn the movie on and I watch the first few minutes. I'm like, oh, I have watched this movie before more than once. Why do I never remember that I've watched this movie? And like I said, a big part of it is you can make a decent movie that's entertaining, but if it doesn't have anything noteworthy in it, if it's not anything significant, it doesn't have to be significantly new. If there's nothing real notable about it, there's no amazing breakout actor performances that you want to see them do more. There's no story that sticks with you. There's, cause to be perfectly honest, I've seen this vampire movie before. I have absolutely no idea how it ends, and my internet kicked out in the middle of when I was watching it. And instead of resetting the router and being like, okay, well, fine, I'll just rewatch this movie and then I'll do the review, I just decided to say, hey, I've already seen this movie and I forgot that I watched this movie. I don't need to see anymore. I've already seen it. Watching this again, it's not going to change the ending that I already know and have forgotten. But I think it's a unique opportunity to do a review on this type of movie that I see come up more than once. They're not bad. It's not a bad movie at all. In fact, this is a pretty enjoyable movie. It's got some comedic moments. If you're I don't want to say a diehard, like, not Twilight fan, but if you've picked on Twilight, if if you think that's a little convoluted, if you like vampire movies, but you also kind of like comedy, then I think it would be great to check this out. The downsides, of course, are that it's not originally in English, and I know a lot of people have a hard time with dubs. I know a lot of people really don't like reading subtitles. I know a lot of people really would just prefer to watch it in their native language, and they don't want translations to be a part of it, and I get that. Sometimes it can be difficult to follow, and there are some times where you want to watch a movie and you kind of want to have it on in the background where you're listening, but you don't necessarily have to be engaged all the time, and it can be very difficult if the movie's originally in a different language to be able to kind of passively put it on without the laser focus of making sure that, like, the captions match what they're saying and you're not losing something in translation, or that what the overdub is saying is kind of going on is actually what's going on. And it also can be a little difficult when you're watching a movie and their mouths don't match what you're hearing, because it kind of gives this sensation that something's wrong. I don't know if you've ever experienced it with YouTube videos or, sometimes even with movies where, like, the audio loads at a different speed than the actual video does. So the audio tracking and the visual that you're watching don't match up. That annoys the living daylights out of me when I'm watching a movie, being like, no, his mouth clearly just said, let's get on the plane, but then the dialogue that I just heard is like, here's your seat, sir, and it doesn't match, and so I know that throws people off. And when you have an overdubbed movie where the movie was filmed in its native language and then a different language is just recorded over it and it does not match the mouth movements of characters, I know that can be very hard to watch for some people. And so I would caution you with that, because the entire movie is like that, obviously, because the entire movie was recorded and was originally made in Spanish. But I think it's a neat little story of a teenager who kind of gets in over their head, pretending to be somebody else in a chat room, and then they just continue pretending because they really like a girl. And it's over the top and it's goofy, and of course it has the over the top, kind of goofy vampire horror. It has the comic relief characters, it has the love interest, it has the actual danger. So all in all, like I said, it's an enjoyable watch. It just has a lot of things not really helping it out. Like I said, there's the language overdub. There's the fact that it doesn't do anything significantly new. It feels very similar to kind of parody movies that were made in the U.S., like Vampires Suck, which is a direct, like, Twilight stinks, here's a parody movie about it, that came out in the very, like, parody movie era when we were getting, scary movie, epic movie, date movie, disaster movie, Meet the Spartans, Vampires Suck, The Hungry Games. We were getting all of these parody movies made of stories that uh, were prominent at the time, and we got a lot of them. They were kind of almost like a straight to Comedy Central vibe for quite a while in the early 2000s. And this isn't any different than that, really. So I'm not necessarily saying that it's forgettable. It's a decent, enjoyable outing, but it is kind of forgettable. And I don't, it's hard to say that's not a criticism because I don't really see what they could have done better or differently. I think it's just the very nature of the fact that it is a foreign language film, but it isn't advertised as a foreign language film when you're looking at it on Netflix. And I think that affects it negatively because you're not really in that headspace of expecting to have to read subtitles or expecting the overdub, which I also think is a problem with another Netflix film that came out that I did watch last year. I believe it's called Killer Book Club. Um, that's another one that was shot in a different language and then it was overdubbed. There's a lot that's lost in translation between English and the original language. And that one's not a comedy. That one is supposed to be just a straight up slasher, or kind of a straight up slasher. And a lot is lost between the original translation and the dub, and I think it does affect the story quite a bit. But that one also has the same it kind of falls victim to the same thing of it being forgettable, not because it's bad, but just because there's nothing really significantly notable. The one of the big things is if you have a mask for your slasher that's spooky or scary or memorable, your movie ends up being a lot more memorable. If you have great one-liners or you have a breakout performance by somebody that's just special, those things really make movies notable. They make horror movies notable. Also, if you can give somebody an original story, an original scare, something different, then it's so much more memorable. And actually, one of my biggest criticisms of Hollyblood is the fact that the opening sequence to this movie bears so much resemblance to the most notable and memorable scenes from Let the Right One In, and then the American reboot of Let Me In, which is also a vampire movie. The opening sequence essentially kind of, I don't want to say rips off because it's a very accusatory term, but just replicates the famous pool scene from both of those films. That's so iconic. And so when your opening sequence is really just a rehashing of this very iconic scene, it doesn't make your film memorable. It just reminds people of this other film that was very good. And then when you have the kind of comedic performances, they draw parallels to other things. Like, oh, this is like Vampires Suck, or oh, this is making fun of Twilight. When your entire film makes you think of other things, it's hard to be memorable in itself. So if you like foreign language films, if you're okay with English overdubs, and you just kind of want like a campy, kind of fun, silly vampire outing with some violence and some inappropriate but very endearing and adorable dialogue from the main character's father. He's very, like, he was raised in the 80s. He has no idea the PC terms for anything, but he's just trying to be a supportive father. So a lot of his vernacular can be a little bit inappropriate because it turns out where his son is pretending to be a vampire to impress a girl, his father thinks he's gay. And so that makes for some comedic, misunderstandings here, but his father is very supportive of that, just isn't sure how to be supportive. And so that can be very endearing. But like I said, there's nothing particularly new or different or special or surprising in this film, but it's just kind of an enjoyable watch. For my 2 cents, because, like I said, I wanted to talk about this because it's something I've experienced before where I have forgotten I have watched it. And I watched probably about half of this movie before I figured out, before my internet kicked out, and I was like, wait, I'm pretty sure I've seen this movie. Um, I don't think the movie should be punished because of that. I think that I would actually like to see the actors that I saw in this movie in other things. I think that they have, good chops. I'd love to see what they can do in other roles, even if they are Spanish speaking. I don't mind the dubs personally. But like I said, pulling from so many different areas instead of just doing your own thing when it comes to making a film makes your film pretty much forgettable because all you're doing is reminding me of other films. If you have seen this movie, or if you have any opinions on foreign language that's dubbed in English, if you prefer reading subtitles, if you prefer English dubs, or if you would prefer just watching things that are in your own language so that get the nuances, I would love to know your opinions. So hit the comments down below, and I will talk to you tomorrow for day 21. Have a great